There's a reason flash storage isn't called electronic non-volatile memory storage. IBM Flash Storage is fast, cloud-ready, scalable and surprisingly affordable. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.
Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
Welcome to the ITPro Podcast, your weekly guide to the most important topics in the IT industry.
So, this week has been something of a vindication for us flesh and blood journalists.
Yeah, we win.
You may remember that Microsoft previously made the decision to replace a good chunk of its people journalists for its news organisation with AI systems and machine learning algorithms, which was a bad decision in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, when I heard it, I was like, this isn't going to work, because other people have tried it and the writing comes out a bit weird and stuff, and replacing the whole editorial team with an AI was a bad idea, but the writing wasn't actually the problem. It is effectively facial recognition, really. To illustrate a story about Little Mix, the AI pulled in a picture of one of the singers, but it wasn't the right one. They have two mixed-race singers, and it just couldn't identify between the two of them, which is a known problem in AI. So I don't know how
which we'll be talking about later on.
Yeah, I don't know how they keep getting this wrong. Anyway, and then it started pulling in stories about itself being rubbish, and the odd editors who are there were trying to stop it, but it was being rebellious and it kept putting up the wrong picture because it was drawing in stories about it putting up the wrong picture, and it was just like a positive feedback loop for something incredibly negative, and just shows really why robot journalists are rubbish and flesh and blood journalists are great.
So, having established that you definitely need journalists, later on in the show, we'll be talking about whether you really need a chief data officer with special guest Caroline Carruthers, CEO of data consultancy Carruthers and Jackson. But first, let's talk about this week's top news stories.
Yes, and we are back onto the matter of facial recognition, specifically that IBM has decided to shutter its facial recognition efforts altogether, and Amazon has put in place a 1-year moratorium.
Both are directly linked to the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests in the US and abroad, which have erupted over the alleged murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And we do have to say alleged for legal reasons.
Yes, so IBM has specifically voiced concerns that the technology could be used for mass surveillance. A lot of this is related to police action. We've seen elsewhere facial recognition software being used to identify people who are in protests. And protesting in the US is a First Amendment right. Over here, it's protected under human rights laws as well. You can't just be going around facially recognizing everybody who happens to be in the street at that time, in possible pursuit of criminal charges when they're not really doing anything, especially when you consider what the case with this has all arisen about, is where the victim, George Floyd, seems to not have actually been doing anything wrong at all.
Aside from the ethical implications of facial recognition and surveillance in general, the particular problem with facial recognition technology as currently deployed is that it's really quite flawed. In particular, it has a really bad record for misidentifying people of colour, which is a big problem when it is deployed for police and law enforcement purposes, because it results in wrongful arrests.
Yeah, I'd like to point everyone back in the direction of last week's podcast episode, actually, which was focused on gender, but we did touch on this a little bit. Data bias, which is part of this. AI facial recognition systems and a lot of other systems are trained primarily on white male faces, and then white female faces, and then darker skinned males, and then darker skinned females. So yeah, it's a rubbish in, rubbish out situation. I think it's worth going over what IBM CEO Arvind Krishna has said in a letter to Congress, which is that artificial intelligence is a powerful tool that can help law enforcement keep citizens safe. But vendors and users of AI systems have a shared responsibility to ensure that AI is tested for bias, particularly when used in law enforcement, and that such bias testing is audited and reported, which I think covers what we were just saying very, very well.
It's particularly interesting that IBM has decided to pretty much shutter all of its facial recognition projects, which it was, in many respects, leading the way in. That was one of the company's more successful cloud units, particularly in terms of the technological progress. It wasn't perfect by any manner of means, but it was, one of the leaders in the field, and it's basically just shut all of that down. Now, that's in stark contrast to Amazon, which has put a 1-year moratorium, as you said, on selling its facial recognition technology to the police. Now, its rationale for this is that it's hoping Congress will come up with a suitable regulatory framework for facial recognition use in that time. A more cynical person might suggest that this is simply, kicking the can down the road for a year in the hopes that the current unrest will blow over and that it can go back to selling facial recognition technology to law enforcement agencies around the world without risk of sparking an outcry.
Yeah, which is entirely possible, although this particular unrest seems to be just kind of a bit more than it has been in the past. It seems to have a bit more momentum, a bit more power. Part of the problem with this relying on Congress trying to come up with something within a year is that regulation always lags behind technology. We've recently published something on anticipatory regulation, but it's a big gamble to take.
Now, speaking of IBM, our second story is slightly less rosy for the cloud giant. IBM this week experienced a fairly sustained cloud outage, which resulted in a lot of its services keeling over.
Yes, it's lasted for about 5 hours, starting at 10:30 p.m. BST on Tuesday and resolved just before 3 a.m. on Wednesday morning. So, for those of us in the UK, it's kind of like, well, everyone's in bed, so who cares? But obviously that is a big issue elsewhere because that's working hours.
The outage affected a number of IBM's products, including some of its Red Hat product divisions. It said last night that it was focusing on external network provider issues, quote, but there were no further details at this time.
Yeah, it shows in some ways the fragility of a technology that we're all depending on very heavily at the moment. The cloud has enabled us to all or largely work remotely, increase our flexibility in a way that was possibly not even thought of before the current COVID crisis. But if it falls over, it falls over, and you have a major problem if everything you do is cloud-based.
Of course, it's also proof that outages can happen to anyone, even the biggest technology giants. So it, for me, raises the spectre of, how prepared are you as a company for a prolonged outage? What is your disaster recovery plan? What are your backups like? Do you have any failovers or business continuity systems in place to protect you? Because as we've seen with this latest IBM outage and with previous outages and data breaches and, all manner of technical problems affecting not just IBM, but Microsoft, Amazon, Google, you name it. Nobody is immune from these kind of things. So, it pays dividends to make sure that you've thought about this kind of thing at some point and planned for it.
And finally, patients using an app created by the controversial company Babylon Health to book GP appointments were able to see the video consultations of other patients.
This is a big no-no, which I believe is the technical term.
It's like accidental embarrassing bodies, really. In seriousness, though, one patient on Twitter said he was given access to more than 50 video consultations belonging to other patients through the app. What do you do in that situation? I guess, well, you contact the GPs who then contact Babylon Health because they put a stop to it relatively quickly by just stopping video consultations.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one way to address the issue.
Yes, amputate.
The company has also reported itself to the ICO, although it's said that only a small number of patients have been affected. It's definitely likely to be a breach of GDPR. I mean, health data is considered one of the most sensitive categories of personal information.
Yeah, which the ICO have said in their statement. Yes, and with GDPR as well, it's not necessarily about the quantity, but also the gravity of the breach or the leak. And this certainly has a big gravity to it. Now, once again, this has, kind of remote working, remote living implications. We're all being encouraged to use these kind of services, not just now, but in the future. And I tell you what, I was a bit skeptical before about doing a video consult with my GP. I am even more kind of like, no, I'd rather go in a hazmat suit and go and see you in person than, kind of risk having my conversations broadcast to the rest of the patients who go there.
I think it's a damaging blow for the kind of nascent adoption of video conferencing technology within healthcare and within the NHS in particular. It's a useful service, and it's one that should be more widely implemented on the proviso that it is done safely and efficiently and minimizing the possibility for these kinds of issues to occur.
We're going to take a quick break now, but when we're back, we'll be speaking to Caroline Carruthers, CEO of data consultancy Carruthers and Jackson, about whether companies really need a chief data officer. See you after the break.
The IBM Flash storage solution can be broken down into 3 S's. Speed, retrieve data fast and efficiently. Scalability, grow your storage as your business grows. Simplicity, easily migrate and integrate with existing systems. Oh, and there's a 4th. It's surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price from as little as 1,300 kroner. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Visit ibm.biz/flash offer now.
Welcome back. Now, data is becoming increasingly important for modern businesses, and more organizations are trying to become data-driven in both their thinking and their operations. At the heart of this change is a relatively new C-level position, the Chief Data Officer. But what does a CDO actually do, and how much of a priority should it be for companies to hire one?
Here with us to discuss whether companies really need a CDO is Caroline Carruthers, CEO of data consultancy Carruthers and Jackson. Caroline, welcome.
Hi Jane, it's nice to be here, thank you.
So I was wondering if you could kick us off by telling us what a CDO actually does on a day-to-day basis.
I think that's quite a big question because no day is quite like any other day, but I can talk about the point of a CDO, which might be helpful. So we've kind of got to the point now in business where we recognise data as an asset in the same way that your finances, your operational assets are, and they have strategic level people who look after that asset for the good of the whole company. And effectively, that's what your chief data officer is doing for your data. It's working across the whole company and making sure that you leverage that asset, that you're safe, and that basically you're getting the best value you can from it.
So how does the role of the CDO relate to other C-suite IT roles like the CIO or the CTO?
I think that there should be very symbiotic roles. And I think what started to happen when the Chief Data Officer started to emerge was it became a little bit adversarial and there was no need for it. I think the CIO has got enough spinning plates to cope with that working with the Chief Data Officer would really, really help them. The difference that I normally explain, the difference between the two roles, is if the CIO is looking after the bucket, So it's making sure that the bucket, which is the system, has no holes in it, that it's the right size bucket, that it's in the right place, that it's made out of the right material. And the chief data officer is looking after the fluid in the bucket. So where it's coming from, where it's going, is it the right quality? Now, if you use that analogy, they have to work together. The CIO can't move the bucket and not tell the chief data officer, because then you're going to have a big puddle. And obviously, by the same token, the chief data officer can't suddenly change the fluid in the bucket because the material might not be the right one to look after it anymore.
That's a good analogy.
Thank you.
Regular listeners of the podcast will know that Jane is a big fan of analogies.
It's a house analogy.
I think she might have a new one to add to the stable.
Well, I can give you loads more, don't worry.
So many smaller companies or companies without a dedicated CDO position will have been performing a lot of these functions effectively through the office of the CIO or equivalent positions. What is the advantages of having a dedicated CDO versus just having that fall into the normal IT organization?
If you think about the other C-suite roles, and we can, use a little bit of what we were talking about earlier on. When you start a small organisation as a chief exec, you end up doing the role of a chief finance officer yourself. But when you get to a certain size, it really does help to have somebody whose main focus is that asset. And it's the same with data. There's a lot that you can do to leverage it, to use it, to make sure that you're safe and that you're not making some major mess ups with it. But you do get to a point where your volume of data or the quality of data that you're using or the security of your data is such a point that you need a specialist whose main focus is that particular asset that you're looking after.
At what point does it become obvious that that's what you need to do? You need to move from having whoever is in charge of IT, kind of relinquish that bit in the same way that the CEO relinquishes finance?
See, I'm not sure it's about relinquishing it, because I think we've lumped this into IT, and I believe we've done them a disservice. So there's a large part of what you do with data hasn't got anything to do with IT. It's more about people, if anything. It's how people ingest the data, create the data, work with it, and hopefully argue and make decisions based on the back of it. Those things aren't IT roles, but I think we've almost sucker punched the poor IT department for a long period of time by assuming that it was their responsibility to look after all the data as well as the container that the data sat into. And I believe we've done them a big disservice.
So in terms of that system, those systems that hold and organize data, what kind of changes have you seen in the last couple of years that have fueled this massive growth in data specialists and data-driven organizations?
I think the biggest one is probably the volume of data that we're dealing with. So I think there's a lot of statistics out there on how much data we're currently creating. A lot of it, I'm not quite sure about the value of it. I'm not sure I'll care what my sister had for dinner last night in 10 years' time. But there will be stuff out there that is valuable and useful. And it's important that we start and separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to data. When we started thinking about how we tackle data, we trended to try and treat it all the same. So we had systems that looked after it in very similar fashions. And I think what we're starting to get to now is a point where we realise that we need to treat our crown jewels of our data very differently from how many tea bags we ordered yesterday.
So, one of the reasons that organisations might want to look at their data, so, perhaps not how many tea bags we bought, but the shop might want to know how many tea bags we bought and how frequently we do. That's, obviously an example of monetising data. At what point should organisations think about monetising the data they have, or is this a bit more of a tricky thing to deal with?
I think it's a very tricky thing to deal with, and most organisations really don't understand the value of their data. And I would always advocate understanding the value of your data before you try and monetize it. So an example of why would be, we worked with one organisation who really focused on the monetisation of their data, and they had some great data, please don't get me wrong. If they'd sold it in the way that they wanted to, they would have completely undermined another core offering that they had in another part of the business and crippled that part of the business. So the value of the data wasn't worth the detriment to the overall organisation, if that makes sense. So it's not just about monetising it, it's about understanding the value of it, and also explicitly being transparent about what they're doing. I'm a big fan of building data ethics into everything we do, and you have to have transparency to be able to get there.
So how can a CDO help with that problem, help with identifying the value of data and what you should actually be doing with it?
Well, one of the beauties and the things that I love about being a chief data officer and working with organisations to help them is that data flows all the way through the organisation. So the chief data officer gets to look across the whole breadth of the organisation, and there's not a lot of roles within a company that lets you do that. And that ability to see the breadth of the organisation helps you look for opportunities. It helps you create linkages in a way that maybe you haven't. And it's almost the anti-silo role because you have to follow the data.
So with that in mind, if companies do want to properly invest in their data and in processing and managing their data properly, what tools do they need to arm their new CDOs with in order for them to do that?
If I can just take a slight sidestep, technology is only one small part of the puzzle. So we work with 12 different elements. We have a model at Carruthers and Jackson that we use that covers 12 different elements. Only one of those elements is technology. And the problem I tend to find with organisation is that it's the one they suddenly become fixated on the most because it's the easiest one to put a tick in the box and say, we have a new visualization tool or we have a new governance tool. Taking some time to understand what you want from your data, so your strategy, the risks you're facing, have you got a data literate culture and what do you intend to do about it? Taking time to do all of those things will help you identify what the right technology tools are for what's going to make the biggest difference to you going forward.
Obviously, we are in a state of flux at the moment. What can the CDO do, or what can data do in order to make the most of this new normal that we're coming into?
Some lessons that I think we could learn going forward for data especially is actually we've accepted good enough to be able to move forward. We've adapted quickly and we've understood the benefits of working collaboratively, and I would really hate to lose that kind of newfound attitude in the future. Obviously, we can't compromise on things like safety, and you talked about data bias and all those other things that we need to take seriously. But I really would want to advocate, this working together and adapting together ethos that we've all had.
Well, I think that is a very insightful point, but unfortunately, that is all we've got time for this week. Thank you once again, Caroline, for joining us.
No, thank you for having me.
To hear more from Caroline, sign up for your free ticket to ITPro Live, where she'll be giving a keynote speech on data-driven digital transformation.
You can find a sign-up link for ITPro Live, as well as links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website, www.itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we're at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn.
Don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you find podcasts to never miss an episode. And if you've enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review. We'll be back next week with more news and analysis from the world of IT. Until then, goodbye.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.
There's a reason flash storage is called flash storage and not electronic non-volatile computer memory storage. From quick and efficient data retrieval to instant scalability, everything about IBM flash storage is fast. It's also cloud-ready and surprisingly affordable, with a recommended monthly price of 2,200 kroner for 24 terabytes of all flash. Order by the 30th of June and pay nothing for 90 days. Find out more at ibm.biz/flash offer.